Good morning, everybody. One of my favorite questions to ask somebody when I'm getting to know them for the first time is tell me your story. Tell me about yourself. Tell me who you are. Tell me about your life. And stories can be powerful things. One of the things that we do as a family when we're gathered together with, whether it's my immediate family or my extended family, is we swap stories. And sometimes we've told these stories before, but sometimes there's someone new around the table or in the gathering, and we get to tell the story for the first time. But for them, one of my stories from the family that I grew up in was when I was a child. I grew up overseas. I mention that frequently in sermons. That's like one of those bingo things. If you've been here for sermon bingo, a lot of you are new to that, but that'll be coming up in December. Little preview there. Anyway, one of the stories I tell is about when I was a child. So when I was a kid, grew up overseas. We went on a family vacation to Scotland. So we lived in England. We drove all the way up to Scotland, which is kind of a long drive, even though England's a small country. And we went for a vacation, rented an old farmhouse with my family and another family. And my dad got to go golf at St. Andrew's Golf Course. Like, we're the oldest golf course in the world. He got to golf at the old course there. We did stuff. We looked for the Loch Ness Monster at Loch Ness. We didn't see it. But we just kind of did the whole Scotland thing. We toured Edinburgh. And then one of the things we decided we were going to do on this family trip, I was probably 12 or 13 years old. We decided that we were going to go on a horseback ride. So we went to this place where you could ride ponies, around this area and just kind of see the Scottish countryside. And while we were waiting to go on this horseback ride, we were hanging out in like a gift shop area. And I don't know if you know this about Scottish people, but their accents are very different than our accents. And I'm with my sister, and we're hanging out in this gift shop area. And there's a young woman behind the register, older than me, but I'm like I said, 12 or 13, and she's maybe in her 20s or something. She's behind the cash register. And she says to my family these exact words: "Would you like to pee now?" And I'm 12 or 13. I don't know what's happening right now. I don't know why this lady said this to me, but I'm like, because the horseback ride's long, like I'm not sure how to process what she's said. But we realized that she's got a very thick Scottish accent, and the question she asked us is if we'd like to pay for the horseback rides at this point. Would you like to pay now? And it came out that way, and of course that's the funniest thing in the world for a 12 or 13-year-old. But you found it amusing as well, and so there you go. Another story that we tell with my extended family, many of whom are a part of this church family, is the time where my nephews and we'd go for hikes and stuff, and this is before I had kids, and my nephews, Jake and Cody, we'd be hanging out, like exploring, doing different things. And I would take them when they were young enough to like be able to swing from my arm. Like I'd be able to pick them up and like swing them like this. They're much bigger now. But at one point I could do that, and we'd go to these, like there'd be a mud puddle or something on a trail. So we'd be hiking and there'd be like an obstacle of some sort. And my thing that I would do with them is I'd grab them by their arms and I would try to swing them across the mud puddle or the obstacle, and I would do like the Indiana Jones theme song while I was doing this. They knew what the assignment was, right? They are Indiana Jones in this moment, and they have the whip is my arm or whatever, or this is the tree branch, and their arms are the whip, and I'm swinging them across an obstacle, and I'd go dun 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 dun, dun, and then swing them across whatever the obstacle was that we were trying to get over. And one time I did this, we were out on a trail, and I get Cody safely across the obstacle, and I go to swing Jake across the mud puddle, and I'm like, dun, 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 and something happens, and I don't know what happened. He slipped somehow and just ended up like fully planting in the mud. And I felt horrible, of course. I am so sorry. Now I got a muddy like 6-year-old, that we're trying to figure out what to do with on this outing. And it's like, the Uncle of the Year award goes to, it's Donnie Johnson. Get to accept this award. There's this moment where we tell that story. That's one of the stories that we tell. Like, hey, one time we were out hiking and this happened. When we tell our stories, stories are a powerful way to connect with people. And I love when I get to know somebody for the first time, I'm like, I will ask that question. What's your story? You always lived in Spokane? Are you new to the area? And it's a really good way of connecting with someone at a deep level pretty quickly and finding points in common. Like, no, I didn't live here in Spokane until I was 14. I used to live over here. And you find these little points of connection with people as you hear their stories. One of the things that I love about sports, by the way, I know not everyone's a sports fan and in this room, but one of the things that I connect with about sports specifically are the stories. You know, whether it is the story of Kurt Warner, who was bagging groceries at a grocery store because he'd been cut as the fourth string quarterback of the Green Bay Packers, and now he's working for $5.50 an hour packing groceries at the local grocery store where he lived. And then he finally gets the opportunity to get called back up into the big leagues and works himself back into a starting position of an NFL football team, and he wins a Super Bowl, and he's the Super Bowl MVP. There's these really powerful, just human stories that we get to hear from the world of sports. The Olympics recently, there was tons of them, right? People that, worked at their family restaurant and then trained on the weekends or whatever, and now they're here winning Olympic gold. That's one of the things that I love about sports, are those kinds of stories. The reality is stories are powerful. When you tell a story to somebody or you hear a story, even some of the little short ones that I just shared, there are certain chemicals, hormones that your brain will release as you hear a story. And those stories will help you feel things. You'll feel emotional connection with the storyteller or with the characters in the story as the story's being told. It's things like oxytocin that's released, that's a connection chemical, or even the stress reaction where you'll start to feel the emotions of that story. And the reality is, if we're thinking about this on an even deeper level, we inhabit stories. There's stories that we tell about our whole lives, where we think about stories, whether it's for good or for bad. Sometimes people just tell themselves a story about, I am a loser, I've always been a loser, I've never been able to accomplish anything, and the story goes way back, and they will tell the story of their life in their own head without even thinking about it, about how their life has played out. And we kind of live in these stories. Stories are very powerful things. I want to talk about your story this morning. The difference that telling your story can make when you are talking to somebody who maybe doesn't share your faith. Your story, particularly when it comes to Jesus, can be one of the most powerful tools you have in sharing the gospel with somebody and practicing this idea of evangelism. We're going to be in John chapter 9. I want you to go ahead and get ready for that. We'll be John chapter 9 starting in verse 1 in just a few moments. But we're in this series right now that I've described it as the couch to 5K of evangelism. And so the idea is simply this, that if you're going from being someone who sits on the couch primarily to being a runner, there's a program that someone came out with, I don't know how many years ago, that's all over the internet called Couch to 5K, where you take baby steps towards being more of an athletic person and being someone who runs and things like that. And there's a program to follow and all of that. And this is we're using that metaphor for evangelism to talk about this idea of living an invitational life, engaging with the mission of Jesus, and taking baby steps towards being more involved in the mission of Jesus, specifically when it comes to sharing our faith with a world that desperately needs the hope that only Jesus offers. And sometimes that can feel overwhelming when you first begin to think about it. How I'd like to share my faith with people, but that seems so intimidating. So we're taking baby steps. We're taking little steps, one step by step over the course of these weeks. And the first week of the series, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the importance of just even vision, even seeing people the way Jesus saw them, seeing ourselves as being invited into the mission of Jesus. Because the invitational life is not just for the people out there that need to know Jesus, but we're being invited into his mission as well. We are also being invited as we extend the invitation to other people, to this adventure of evangelism. Not a burden, not a guilt trip, but a way of engaging in Christ's mission in tangible, practical ways, step by step. That's what we're all about for this series, An Invitational Life. And I want to talk about our current baby step, our current step on the couch to 5K of evangelism, which is one word. If I'm going to encapsulate this whole message into one word, it's the word witness. Being a witness, because it needs a little more context than just that one word. But what does it mean to share your story? What does it mean to be a witness of God's work in you towards a world that once again needs the hope of Jesus? And I want to get into these ideas today by talking through a story. I love this story. John chapter 9, and we're going to read verses 1 through 7. We'll jump right in, and I'm going to interrupt this telling of this story quite a bit to talk about what we see here as we kind of an exposition of the text here this morning. So John chapter 9, verses 1 through 7 to start with. As he passed by, Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. So this incredible, amazing account of Jesus healing a man blind from birth. And the disciples see this man in his situation, and they've got a theological question in their head. They're like, their understanding of why bad things happen to people is in this kind of category. Like, this guy must have sinned. I don't know exactly how that works to be born blind because you sinned. Or maybe it was his parents. Like, Jesus, help us understand what we're seeing. We see someone living in a very difficult situation. This man is blind. He's never been able to see his whole life. And maybe they didn't know that when they asked the question. Well, they said that he was born blind. Why did this happen? And Jesus says to him, like, hey, it's neither of those things. He says, this happened in this man's life for this moment, so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And he gets something, the man gets something in this situation that we sometimes don't get on this side of heaven, right? Which is a reason for difficulties that we go through. Because a lot of times when we go through a challenging situation, the first question we have after dealing with the immediate crisis is like, why? Why is this happening? Why did God let this happen? You know, often God redeems these difficult situations and we can kind of see the good that comes out of it. And we should believe that God's going to do something good even with this difficult thing, even when we're right in the middle of it. We did a series at the end of last year talking about the story of Joseph called God Meant It for Good. And we told the story about how Joseph was able to see in his lifetime, over the course of his life, why this horribly unfair thing happened to him, so that God would send him in advance to be on a rescue mission when a famine would happen, where thousands of people's lives would be saved, because Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, this brutal, painful thing that happened to him. He was able to see on the other side how God could redeem this. And he says, you meant this for evil, God meant this for good. We don't always have the answers when we have those difficult questions and difficult things that we go through. Like, why is God allowing this to happen? Why did this happen to me? But we can trust, because we know the character of God, that God is good and God can use even this difficult thing we might be going through for his glory, to help other people, and ultimately for the good. And Jesus tells the disciples here, he says, this man has been born blind for this moment. I don't think the disciples were geared up and like thinking they were going to be able to help him in this moment. I think they were just like, hey, I see this guy, his life looks tough. Like, think about being born blind in the ancient world. Just the difficulty of your life. There's no Americans with Disabilities Act where there's railings and ramps and things like that. And there's not Braille yet. That hadn't been invented. This man's life was difficult. There's no social safety net. Right? He would be just dependent upon being led around by somebody that could help him safely navigate obstacles, and then maybe be placed somewhere on a main street where he could beg. He could get enough food, enough money to be able to buy enough food to be able to survive. But his life was difficult. His life was very challenging. And he's in this situation because Jesus is going to transform his situation in a moment for this amazing miracle that we get recorded that we're still reading about almost 2,000 years later. God had work that was going to be displayed in him. And then Jesus makes this just comment about work. He says, in light specifically, he says, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And that's this image of Jesus bringing light to a dark world, and he says, the time is short. We got a lot of work to do. Night is coming, just like if you're working out in the fields and night is coming and you know you're not going to be able to do your work in the dark. He says, we got to get the work done. And he says, I'm bringing light into this dark world. I told you the story this summer. If you were here for this, you might have heard this one. But there's the story of Robert Louis Stevenson when he was a young boy. And I got a picture of a lamplighter. I want to show you what this looks like. So back in Victorian England, in the 1800s, there was a job that, technology has done away with this job, but there's people that would go around and they would light the oil street lamps. They would go out there with a long pole or maybe a ladder, and they'd climb up and light the street lights so that you could see as you're going around the city of London or other places in Victorian England. This was what they did. This was a job. Someone would be paid to go out every night and light the lamps so that there'd be a more safe environment. People could see where they're walking. One day, Robert Louis Stevenson was staring out the window as he was a young boy. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote the books Treasure Island, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He was a great writer of the Victorian era. So 1800s England, he's looking out of his window in his bedroom and just watching the lamplighter light the lamppost, and he's just transfixed by it. And his mother asks him, hey, what are you doing? Your face is just up there against the window and you're watching this. What are you doing? And the young Robert Louis Stevenson replied, I'm watching the man punch holes in the darkness. And I just love that phrase. It's such a powerful and vivid image for me when I think about what God is calling his followers to do in this world. Jesus calls to his disciples and says, there's so much work to do. He says, I am the light of the world, and I'm bringing light into a dark world. We have work to do. And then he sets about, that would have been enough of a story and an amazing story right there to write it down and record it for us to read today. But then he does the most unusual thing, right? Jesus spits on the ground. Jesus, what are you doing? He begins to make mud. And he anoints the man's eyes with that mud that he made out of his spit in the dirt. And he says, I want you to go and wash in this pool in the city. And he does. He goes, navigates his way to the pool. He washes, and then it says, just simple words in verse 7, so he went and washed and came back seeing. Amazing. And notice that Jesus doesn't really have a formula. If you look at all of his miracles and all of his healings, it's not like he doesn't do this one all the time. It's like, this guy needs to be able to see. Jesus is going to do what he does with all the blind people. He's going to make the little pool or the little mud thing. And no, he doesn't. He goes case by case. He is obedient to what the Father is calling him to do. He listens to the Father. There's no formula. And in this case, he heals the man in this unusual way. And the miracle takes place, and it's such an understated thing in verse 7 that he washed and he came back seeing. But think about the level of miracle this is. Someone that was born blind, that was never able to see, and the neural pathways that would have needed to be healed to be able to interpret what he was seeing. So this man who could never see now sees and is able to walk through the world with boldness and confidence because he's not worried about falling over something and all of this. And it's this amazing miracle, but the story's not over yet. We got to continue and see what happens next. Verses 8 through 12. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said it is he. Others said, no, but he is like him. And he kept saying, I am the man. So they said to him, how were your eyes opened? He answered, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. And they said to him, where is he? He said, I do not know. So God's work created a scene, right? There's this debate that begins, right? Is this him? Like he was always here in this spot. And they're like, no, Yeah, it is him. No, he kind of looks like him, but I don't think that's him. And he says to them, he says, I am the man. I'm the man, right? He says in response to them, he kept saying, it says, no, that's me. So then what happened? How did you? And then he begins to tell his story, his testimony. He is being a witness, right? He's not witnessing, but he's being a witness to what God has done for him. He says this real simple story. It doesn't take long to tell it. The man called Jesus, you've heard of him. He made mud. He anointed my eyes. He said, go to Siloam and wash. And I did. And then after I did that, now I can see. Simple story. But that's his testimony. That's his story that he's going to tell another few times. We'll see how he continues to tell this story. And he's not real he doesn't know everything about Jesus or where he is. And he'll admit what he knows and what he doesn't know. What he does know is that that's what Jesus did for him. I don't know where he is now. They said, I don't know where he is. And then let's continue now, verses 13 to 17. They brought the Pharisees to the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. And this is where you should hear the intense music playing. It was a Sabbath day. Dun, dun, dun. It's uh-oh. When Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. Once again, he gets a chance to tell his story. And he said to them, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. And so they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him, since he opened your eyes? And he said, he is a prophet. So there's this moment where this new tension enters the story. It's been all amazing news, but now it says, we've got to bring the religious leaders in. So they bring the Pharisees in, and they say, what is your take on this? And it says, it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud, which that seems like no big deal to us. But there was all of these really strict regulations built up around the Sabbath day about what was work and what wasn't work. And Jesus deliberately chose to do something that looked like work, which was making mud, which might have looked like mortar for bricks or something. Even though on a small scale, this was forbidden. Even though the Bible didn't condemn it, it broke the rules around the Sabbath day that had been put together by the religious leaders. So now Jesus is in one of these controversies again between him and the religious leaders. The Pharisees are upset, right? And when Jesus would debate with them about this, he'd say, the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You've made all these rigid rules around the Sabbath and what you can and can't do that's made it to where you can't even be blessed by the Sabbath. You're serving a day rather than that day serving you. And he gets a chance, though, in this moment. The man tells his story again, but this time it's super short because I think he can sense the trouble. And he tells his story once again in verse 15. He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. It's super short. This is my story. That's what happened. And you can tell that he's probably a little nervous about where's this going? All these Pharisees are now gathered here. Am I in trouble? And there's this growing realization that this man is having about Jesus. He's starting to understand something about Jesus, and they go, hey, we're divided on this issue. We think it's sinful to work on the Sabbath. He broke our law, but you were blind and now you see. And so we're kind of divided here. We don't know what to make of this. What do you say about him? And he says, well, he's a prophet. He's a prophet. He's someone who speaks on behalf of God. My understanding, this man's understanding. So let's continue the story. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, is this your son, whom you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we do not know. Nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ or the Messiah, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So there's a little courtroom drama going. They call the parents as witnesses, like, tell us, is this your son, and how did he receive his sight? And they can read the room. They know this is not like just a normal, casual conversation. They're nervous. They say, he's old enough, you can ask him. We can verify that he is indeed our son, and yes, he was born blind. There's some consequences now, the weight of what's going on here. And it said in verse 22 that the word was out that Jesus was this controversial character. And if you believe that Jesus was the Messiah, you're in danger of being kicked out of the synagogue in this place. This would have been the center of your community life. This would have been where you worship. This would be like being kicked out of church, asked to not come back again. And in a village like this or a town like this would have been the center of the community life. They would have been shunned from the community. And so it's now dangerous for them to say, yeah, we believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Let's continue the story, verse 24. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" This guy is on another level, right? I like this guy. I love the simplicity of his story, right? There's a confrontation beginning. We start to feel it there. Again, if you haven't felt the tension up to this point, you feel it even more at this point of the story. This isn't going to go over well, right? How he ends it. He's like, "Do you want to be his disciple again? I told you the story once. I'll tell you again, but is it because you want to be his disciples?" And you can almost see the reaction meme of the people going, "Ooh," like, "Oh, man." But I love the simplicity of his story. It's so simple. It's so clear. It's so powerful. "One thing I know. I was blind, but now I see." There's a old song by Sam Cooke, wonderful song. It's called "A Wonderful World," and I'm not going to sing it for you, but the lyrics go like this, and you might recognize it. "Don't know much about history, don't know much biology, don't know much about a science book, don't know much about the French I took, but I do know that I love you. And I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world it would be." And apologies if that song's now stuck in your head the rest of the day. But like that, his story reminded me of that. He says, "I don't know if he's a sinner. I don't know I don't know all the details. I can't answer your deep theological questions about this man Jesus, but what I do know is this one thing I know. I was blind, and I can see now." This is like the disciples with the resurrection story when the disciples in the book of Acts, they've seen the risen Jesus, and they cannot stop talking about it. And their story is simple, and they repeat it time after time after time. Jesus died, and he rose from the grave. And I'm here to tell you about him and tell you about what his teachings were. And my story is simple, but it's that I was an eyewitness to the risen Jesus. And they tell that story over and over and over again. And if you see it, it's all throughout the book of Acts. The book of Acts, they just talk about the resurrection nonstop. It's the topic of every single sermon. It's like this is their main point. I want to shift gears a little bit at this point in the sermon, and I want to start giving you some ways that I want you to think about applying this to your own life. And the first point is this: if you're taking notes, you can follow along. There'll be 3 points to the sermon, but the first point is this: I want you to recognize the power of your own story. Recognize the power of your story. The blind man had a very simple yet very powerful testimony, very powerful story. And I believe that all of us in this room have something like that as well. And it's maybe not as dramatic as the blind man who could now see, but I think we all have ways that we've encountered Jesus, ways that Jesus have worked in our life, things that Jesus has taught us that we could share with somebody. We could shape it into a simple story like this, "I used to be blind, but now I see" kind of story. And I think that if we could do that, this can be one of the most powerful tools that we have in our tool chest to invite other people to follow Jesus. Stories are powerful. Think about for just a moment, what has Jesus done for you? Whether we're talking about your whole life or even just lately. Maybe this morning, maybe you were discouraged and you were encouraged by the worship, and that's a simple story you could tell. Man, I walked into church and I was discouraged and I was worried about so many things, and Craig challenged us to just lay those things aside and enter into worship, and I did, and man, I feel so much better. That's a simple story, but maybe you have a story that you could tell of what Jesus has done for you. The reality is, I could make, if I'm trying to persuade you to something, and I'm trying to think of like ways to get you to buy into whatever argument I have. Like, whatever. I should probably have an example, but I don't have an example. But I'm just trying to convince you of something. It's like, I think you should all do this, whatever. I could put charts, diagrams, statistics, and begin to just try to persuade you with just the weight of evidence I have and all these numbers and things like that. But the reality is a story puts all of those statistics, diagrams, charts to shame with its power to persuade people. The Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, he would go through and try to talk about Jesus and try to convince people of the truth of Jesus' message. And he would speak to them and try to convince them theologically. But you see later in the book of Acts, at the end of the book of Acts, he's just telling his story over and over again. Let me tell you about the God that broke into my life on the road to Damascus. This bright light and a voice from heaven. And he also could not see. He lost his sight in this moment and then had to be prayed for to receive his sight back. But he met the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus, and it changed everything for him. And he went from being someone who persecuted the church to now someone who was a part of it and trying to spread it to all of the ancient world. He just told his story over and over and over again, and you see it throughout the end of the book of Acts in particular. Your story, your testimony of what Jesus has done for you is sort of like the user reviews when you buy something online. Well, that's one of the most effective things when we purchase something online is to read the reviews, right? And I know they can be manipulated. Some people try to game the system and put fake reviews on there and things like that. But when I go to buy something, if I have a question about it at all, I am very closely reading those reviews and looking at how many stars this product has. One of the things that I did that I've been buying for a while is printer ink cartridges on Amazon. Because I don't know if you know this, but the printer business model, like the Canon and Brother printers and all these things, HP, they will sell you a relatively cheap printer for you to use at home, and they'll understand that they can probably make all their money back when you buy the ink refills. And that's why those things are so expensive. But if you didn't know this, now you will know this, you can buy really cheap knockoff ones on Amazon. And they have names like this. Here's some of the ones I saw. Ink for You, and it's number 4 and the letter U. Kingway is another brand. It's like, never heard of that one. Uprint. Inkjet Corner is another one. And if you're going to buy, I have a Brother printer at home, and I buy these ink refills for it, and they're pretty cheap compared with the name brand ones. But I have to be very careful in reading those reviews, right? Because it's really hit or miss on these different ink cartridges you get. You got to read them and say, which one is legit? Which one is got the 2 stars out of 5? I'm going to avoid that one. And so far, I've had pretty good luck with buying these ink cartridges online because of those user reviews. Your story, in a similar way, is sort of your user review when it comes to a relationship with Jesus, where you have people you might encounter, people in your life that want to know, how's it working for you? Are you happy with your purchase? That's a bad way to describe it, but you're in a relationship with Jesus. God's a part of your life. How's that going for you? And your story, your ability to be able to share a little bit of your story is a powerful, powerful thing. Let's get back to our account here in John chapter 9. We were left off in verse 28 here. His response to the sick burn or whatever, right? Do you also want to become his disciples? The Pharisees respond pretty strongly. It says, verse 28, and they reviled him, saying, you are his disciples, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. This little dig about Jesus' parentage. Okay, he says, the man answered, why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard of anyone opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out. So he's kicked out. What his parents were afraid of happened to him. He is kicked out of the religious community. And his testimony in this part now he's putting some weight behind his reasoning about what has happened to him. He says, if Jesus was this sinner like you claim, it's like this wouldn't have happened. And he's saying these things to him, and they're so offended. You were born in sin. You're trying to teach us. And they cast him out of the synagogue. Now verses 35 to 38. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, think about the power of these words, to him, what Jesus' response is, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." And he said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. This is such a powerful ending to the story here. Jesus he says a few more things about it, but we'll stop our reading of the story at this point. But how powerful those words must have felt to him. You have seen him. He says, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Jesus is calling himself the Son of Man. And he says, tell me who that is. And he says, "You have seen him." This man hasn't seen a lot of people. He hasn't seen a lot. There's a lot of things to see, a lot of people to see, a lot of people to tell about what happened to him. But he sees Jesus. And I want to claim to you this morning that a second miracle, even bigger than the first one, happens in this moment. It says the man believed him and he worshiped him. He says, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. That miracle is bigger than the first one. Having blindness cured, physical blindness, that's a really big deal. We'd tell that story to everybody, but the second miracle that happened in this man's life is even bigger. He once was blind spiritually, but now he sees. It's like the line from the song Amazing Grace, from spiritual blindness to now sight. And now this man has two stories to tell. He's got the story of how Jesus cured his blindness, and now he's got this story of how he's been given eternal life by Jesus. Second point, application point for us, and we'll move through these last two relatively quickly, is this: choose the story you tell. Your story's powerful, and you get to choose the story that you tell. There's a wonderful book I've referenced, I think, every week of the series so far called Sent, Living a Life That Invites Others to Jesus. A group of us went through this book at the end of last year. It's a really good book about sharing your faith and some practical ways to do that. And in the book, she talks about the stories. There's a whole chapter on telling your testimony, chapter 9, the easiest story to tell. And in the book, she describes this idea of the different stories that you might give to people depending on what the circumstances are. And if you spent enough time reflecting on your relationship with Jesus, you might discover you have more than just one story. And here's the example from this chapter of the different stories. So there's 3 stories that she talks about. If we could put that up on the screen. There's a rescue story, a surrender story, and a provision or blessing story. And she describes the rescue story as like, how did Jesus find you? How did Jesus become a part of your life? That's the rescue story. The second story, is there something in your life that you've surrendered to Jesus that made all the difference? That you were really stuck in this little area of life, and then you saw something in God's Word that just changed the way you thought about it, and it freed you up from that to live in a new way. Maybe you have a surrender story. The blessing story or provision story at the end is this idea that, hey, God provided for you in a way that's a really cool story to tell. And maybe you have a story of how God came through for you in an amazing way. So if you think about the blind man's stories, he's got 2. He's got the first story to tell about how Jesus saved him from his sins, but he's also got that third story, of course, the pretty powerful provision story, how God provided sight for him when he couldn't see. I want you to think about your own life. You're not going to have a lot of time right now to do that, but I hope that you will spend some time reflecting, maybe in the upcoming week or maybe later today. Do you have any stories like that to tell? Do you have a story of like where your life was before you met Jesus, and then how you met Jesus, and then how your life is different now that Jesus is in your life? That's a simple rescue story. Or maybe you have a surrender story like I talked about, or maybe a provision story where God came through for you. Things were really difficult. You didn't know how this need was going to be met, and God met that need because God is trustworthy, and you can have an example of a story like that you can tell. A lot of our church kids, I grew up in church, and I remember hearing testimonies and things when I was a kid, and we'd tell these dramatic rescue stories. We'd hear stories in church, right? In our kind of Christian culture, we tell these stories that are like, hey, my life was wild before I met Jesus. And then I met Jesus, and then everything changed. It's like the story starts out, I grew up on the mean streets of Chicago. and I had to fight to survive and things like that. And then Jesus came in my life and everything changed. Or I used to run drugs with a biker gang out of Mexico. And it's like, whoa, these dramatic stories. And I almost, when I was growing up in church, I'd almost feel like testimony envy. It's like, I don't have a crazy story like that. My story is pretty simple. I've just been coming to church all my life, and I want to say, you may not have a rescue story. Maybe number one is not like a dramatic story for you. But I think everybody has story number two, story number three. And I love all the stories, like the hearing those dramatic transformation stories. But if you don't have one of those, that's fine. Don't feel bad about that. That's the story of Daniel in the Bible. That's the story of Timothy in the Bible. That's the story of Mary, the mother of Jesus in the Bible. They just followed Jesus from a young age, followed God, was a part of their life from a very young age. And that's an amazing story. And maybe you don't have a dramatic rescue story, but you probably do have a surrender story or a provision story that you might be able to tell. The man born blind, we're not given his name in this story. We don't know much about him other than this account in John chapter 9. But do you think he ever stopped telling that story? Oh my goodness. Probably the rest of his life to whoever would listen. I have to tell you about Jesus, what he has done for me. You see, I was born blind. And I imagine the emotion building and him telling the story. And then one day, Jesus came to my town and I heard his disciples talking, and then he walked over, spit on the ground, made some mud, put it on my eyes, told me to go wash them off in this pool. And I did that, and I can see, and I've been able to see since then. What an amazing, amazing testimony he would have had. And I can't imagine that he ever stopped telling that story the rest of his life. My final kind of application point to you this morning is this. Number 3, embrace your responsibility to bear witness. I want you to consider that if you have a story, if God has... We good? Okay. All right. Embrace your responsibility to bear witness. If you have a story to tell, there's a level of responsibility there that God has given you this opportunity, that there are people that might need to hear your story, that might need to know who Jesus is or understand about how good Jesus is, and that if you have a story, whatever it is, provision, surrender, there's a level of responsibility that goes with that. And we should embrace that and look for opportunities to tell our story to other people who may need to hear it. And I want to read just a short selection of this before we pray from this book sent from this chapter that I was talking about, where she talks about the number of scriptures, the number of times Scriptures invites us to tell our story. So she says, recently I explored the number of times Scripture invites us to tell our story. Consider these prompts. In Psalm 107:2, the psalmist writes, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. In Psalm 66:16, the writer proclaims, come and hear, all you who fear God. Let me tell you what he has done for me. Excuse me. Thanks, everybody. I feel blessed. In fact, throughout the Psalms, you'll find a call to tell your story. It's in Psalm 71:15, we read how the psalmist speaks all day long about the things the Lord has done. Can you imagine the stories of miracles, of victory, and of God's faithfulness as we read, my mouth will tell of your righteous deeds, of your saving acts all day long. Though I know not how to relate them all. We're given the model for doing so by David in Psalm 105:1-2, who says, give praise to the Lord. Proclaim his name, make known among the nations what he has done. Sing to him, sing praise to him. Tell of all his wondrous acts, which he then continues to narrate for the next 30 verses. David, it seems, has a story to tell. Finally, the writer of Psalm 71 even asks God in verse 18 to preserve his life until he declares God's power to the next generation, his mighty acts to all who are to come. As you gather your most significant stories of God's work in your life through salvation, your surrender of any area of your life to him in the way he has provided for you, remember this powerful call to tell the next generation about the Lord.